good to see everyone who's here tonight, whether in person or on Zoom. I know we've had several under the weather in the last few days, and we continually pray that they will be recovered soon and return to us. But we're going to continue into probably one of my favorite parts of this study of apologetics, that is, Christian evidences. Because everything that we have discussed up until this point for the last 6-7 weeks or so has been a building block to the point where we are now. We had to lay a foundation where we established the possibility of the existence of God. We did that by looking at the cosmological argument, that is, the comparison between the creation account and what those who would have us not to believe in the creation account, the atheists, the agnostics, those groups that we talked about, what they put forth as evidence for the things that we see around us. Theirs, of course, being the Big Bang, ours, of course, being supernatural being, i.e. God, who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and always present, who is able to create everything with a design that is so intricate that human minds have yet to discover all of the different intricacies about every little thing we see within this world. We laid that foundation for the existence of God. Then we dealt with, well, if God does exist, since the possibility has been given, if God does exist, then how do you know that this God is the one true God? That the God of the Christian world and the God of the Bible is true. And we broke that down to its very component parts. That mankind has always sought out someone or something to worship. And when you look at the evidences around the existence of God, one of the things that is the strongest for his existence is, of course, the existence of a higher law, a higher moral code that we appeal to. Then we spent the last 3 weeks or so, after having done all of that foundational work, discussing the inspiration of his word, because the blocks build like this. If God exists, if it's possible that God exists, which we did prove, and if God exists, then therefore there is a higher law, we have to show that his word is that higher law and it is reliable. And we did that by looking at historical evidence, by looking at physical evidence from the histories, not just the written record in archaeology as well, but also scientific foreknowledge and things like that. But now we have our character, Mr. Atheist, who we've been appealing to sort of in a mind's eye sort of way, has been built up to this point where now there is a possibility of the existence of God, and if God exists, then there is a higher law, and if God exists, there's all this evidence to show it. But suppose that person who is an atheist or an agnostic comes to you and says this: if there is a God, and if that God is the God of the Bible, who is portrayed within that book as you, pointing to us, would say, as one who is so good and so right and so loving and so caring, then tell me this: why do people get sick? Why are these prayer lists that we mention every week so long and seem to be getting longer? Why are there evil people in the world? Doug briefly brought up some who even we would struggle with at times, of thinking it was possible for them to receive salvation. Even though we have a strong spiritual faith, it is hard sometimes to look at people throughout history who've committed numerous atrocities and think, had they been exposed to the right person, had they had the opportunity to obey the gospel and did, despite what they had done, no matter how heinous, God, who is above us, would have forgiven them. This person who does not believe in God, who is now grasping, trying to find something to, again, discredit all this foundational evidence we've laid so far, will say, if there is a God, why is there so much sickness in the world? Why so much pain? Why so much evil? Why so much suffering? They will point to things like the Holocaust. They will point to things like natural disasters and all the acts of God, as people will call them from time to time. God does not set those things in motion in order to wipe out people in that sort of way. As he did in the earlier days when man's heart was continually on evil in the time of Noah, what did he say? He said that I will never again destroy the world with water. But yet I remember as a 15-year-old boy when Hurricane Katrina came through and my family were going through the ups and downs of all of that. The question on so many lips, whether they had some form of faith or not, is how could God allow this to happen? And so they try to establish this argument. And what's interesting for us and should be most sobering for us when discussing this issue of why evil, pain, and suffering exist in the world is that this is not just an issue with people who abjectly believe that there is no God. This is not just an issue with atheists. If you want to look at probably the most crucial reason why so many people who were reared to believe in God, who were reared to have faith of some kind, will turn away from it, so many examples exist of this being the case. The reason why they drifted from that faith to whatever level they had it was because of some kind of personal tragedy. Consider this. If I was to ask you, and I'll go ahead and do it tonight, who is probably the most famous atheist in the world? Not necessarily in modern history, but just period. Okay, there's one. That's not the one I was looking for.
I didn't hear it. What was it?
Doug, it was, who is the most...
Yeah, well, what did he say?
He said Madeline O'Hare.
Okay. Richard...
That is an extreme... Richard Dawkins is another one. I'm thinking older. Let's think about the one who set the groundwork for what is modern atheism. Charles Darwin. Did you know that at one time Charles Darwin believed in God and professed a form of Christianity? Now we know this was not, of course, true Christianity is based on the Bible, such as we believe, but he professed to be a Christian. That was until in 1851, his oldest daughter fell ill with a terrible disease. Her name was Annie. And on April 23rd of that year, she died. And from that moment on, this man went from being a believer in God to having no faith at all. The reason why the man who laid the groundwork for the evolutionary theory on which so many unbelievers today base at least a portion of their thought goes back to 1851 when this little girl, the tender age of 10, fell ill and died. Think about some other famous people. I remember reading one time in an article, I think it was an Apologetics Press article one time, about a young man who led prayers, read scripture, and was very active in his church in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Not that far out of our backyard. But around 1960 or so, things changed. his sister dies of leukemia. And from that point forward, what faith was in him absolutely collapsed. He went on to become one of the richest media moguls in the South. That is one Ted Turner. Turner Broadcasting, TBS, CNN, all of that. When his sister died of leukemia, he's even said in interviews, that is what destroyed his belief in God, because if one so innocent could die of something so terrible, and if anyone has ever watched someone suffer with that form of cancer or any other form, you can almost, from an emotional standpoint, understand where these people are. In that, it's so hard to watch. And I can't even imagine. You know, when I lived in Memphis years ago, I used to volunteer a lot at St. Jude. One of the greatest places I've ever been. The work they do with those children is just unbelievable, and how they are able to keep such a positive attitude around that hospital when surrounded by so much pain and struggle just baffles me. I used to go and volunteer because I've never been a child with cancer, no, but I was a child in the hospital a lot. And I know what that's like. And I used to go and talk to kids and spend time with them. But there would be those ones that you would visit, and a week or two later they wouldn't be there. And to imagine being in a family like that, going through that, what a trying time that must have been. It would make you question things you believe to your very core. Why do so many people doubt? So many people leave the faith? This question that has been posed by our Mr. Atheist here is probably the reason why, for more cases than we can think of. Because they've seen so much hardship, so much suffering, that they don't understand it. And so therefore, they turn. They say things like this: if there's a God, why do I have cancer? I've heard Christians, faithful Christians, struggling and say that. If there's a God, why am I dealing with this when I have done everything I could for him up until this point? Or you'll hear things like this: if God exists, then why'd they allow my son to be killed in this tornado? Why'd they allow him to be killed on the road by this drunk driver? I had a cousin several years ago who, by no fault of his own, ran over a man in the middle of the night. He walked out in the middle of the road on drugs, we found out later and all, and my cousin was driving home from work. He didn't see him and ran right over him. And I remember them saying after that instance was his family just saying that, why did this happen? Why did God allow this to happen? And my cousin struggled with a lot of guilt with that for a lot of years, and still to this day does. But they ask these questions. So here's the thing: why does it exist? And that's what I want us to spend some time discussing, because we know that God does exist. And it is our imperative then to take this person who would use this as an example for the lack of the existence of God, and be able somehow to show them that yes, this is horrible, and it is an unfortunate part of life. But God does not cause the pain and suffering that we sometimes fall under. It is not His fault, His doing. No, the reason for pain and suffering in this world is far, far beyond that. Because what does John tell us in 1 John 4:8? A verse that's very familiar to all of us. God is what?
Love.
Love. And if God is love, He cannot be the source of such things. We have to understand, first of all, that God created us with a freedom of will. You see, that's another question they'll bring up. If God would punish someone, this is something we'll get into even more next week as we spend the next 2 weeks kind of discussing this. If God does exist and want us to follow Him, why didn't He create us to the point that we just follow Him automatically? Why did He build us up?
He doesn't want that.
Exactly. He doesn't.
He wanted it to be our choice.
And He never has wanted that, Ernie. That's the point.
And where there's a God, there's also something else out there called Satan. The good and the bad part of it.
That's it.
We may get to that a little later on.
That's it. He didn't create us like some great puppeteer with all of us on minionettes somewhere.
He could have made a bunch of robots if he wanted that.
He could have. But rather as an expression of love for us, He gave us the ability to choose. If you think about it, how much deeper of a relationship would it be? And I loved this example. I had a teacher that instilled this in me many years ago. And I really loved this because ever since I have learned this principle, it really opened up a lot of Scripture to me. God is a relational being. And from the time of creation, He has always wanted to have a relationship with the creation. Right? In the garden, what did God do so often?
Walked.
He walked with Adam and Eve. He spent time with them. He has always wanted a relationship with them. He created a free will within us to give us the freedom to make those choices so that that relationship would be deepened as we choose to serve Him. And when man fell short, the sin which entered the world, which really is the source of all of this that we're talking about, as Ernie pointed out, Satan, and specifically as Satan influenced Eve, who brought sin into the world, from the moment that mankind fell short, what did God immediately put into action?
The plan of salvation.
From that moment forward, where that relationship, which was once bonded like this, was broken, immediately from that time forward, He put forth a plan to rekindle it, to bond it back together. Right? The plan of salvation. Genesis 3, verse 15, we've read it many, many times. Where from that point on, we knew the seed of woman was coming. And through that, sin and death would be crushed. You see, there are times that we are going to suffer because sin exists in the world. And therefore, by sin, evil exists. And sometimes good people suffer for the evil of other men. You think about that example of a drunk driver. You think about that example of someone who's killed in a robbery or something like that. There are going to be times that we suffer for the choices of others. We will suffer sometimes for the choices of our own, too, from time to time. You think about if we make a decision to do something God did not have us to do, and we make a decision that is dangerous, that leads to the end of our life, say getting behind a wheel while being intoxicated, say doing some other form like that that wouldn't be proper for us to do. Let's say we get in a standoff with the police and our life is ended by that, for that police officer to protect himself, his partners, his family, and all of that. We will suffer a major consequence because of that. What about the compulsive gambler who spends everything that he makes in feeding that habit and loses everything he had? House, car, family, you name it. There are going to be times that we will suffer for our own decisions, but also for the decisions of others, like in the cases we mentioned. But God's love still exists. Even in the midst of that suffering, whether it's because of our own choices, whether it's because of the choices of others, God's love still exists. And we all have that same freedom.
You know, when you said that even the angels have the choice.
Yes.
Even angels they did not have salvation. They're with God.
Yeah.
And yet some still sin.
That's it.
And they will face the consequences if they don't.
Mm-hmm.
But they have the choice. And remember whenever Jesus prayed in the garden, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me.
Mm-hmm.
You think he had a choice, but he chose to obey his Father and go through with it.
Yep.
Could it be that the plan of salvation started before Adam and Eve ate the fruit that they were bid to eat? It was already in plan. I mean, if
God in His foreknowledge already knew.
If it wasn't, then why did He allow the devil to tempt them like that?
Yeah. God in His foreknowledge already knew. I don't know if you noticed the article in the bulletin. Was it last week? I think it was last week, where the author discussed foreknowledge. I thought that was a really good article, because that's not something we think about. God knows everything and has always known everything. So yes, you make an excellent point, Ernie. In His foreknowledge, He knew already that this would be necessary. So yes, as it is said about Jesus, before the foundations of the world, God set forth this plan so that we could be redeemed to Him.
That's 1 Peter 1:19 through 20.
Mm-hmm.
It says that Christ was foreordained.
Go ahead and read it, Doug, if you've got it open there.
I was looking at it on my phone, but it said that 1 Peter 1:19 and 20
Mm-hmm.
says that before the foundation of the world, Christ was foreordained, obviously for that purpose. If y'all will hang on for just a second, I can be there. 1 Peter 1:19. I'll go back and read 18. Knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, like silver or gold, from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. So that establishes we're talking about Christ's blood and its redemptive power. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you.
Oh, it was pre-planned that He was going to come someday in the future.
Exactly.
Regardless, He gave Adam and Eve free will. He let the devil tempt them, and they made the wrong choice.
Exactly. That's an excellent point. I love the way that's translated, foreordained, too, because that word that we translate ordained means set specifically for that purpose. That has always been His purpose. The reason why the Word became flesh was because that purpose had already been set forth. And that's when you get into some really deep thought about the foreknowledge of God.
Tell me about it.
Beyond what we can humanly comprehend. So maybe I was saying that in more of a accommodative way, because we are bound by time, which God is not. So it's easier for us to understand things within the parameter of time. But yes, it was set forth even before the foundations of the world, as that verse has just said. And another thing too is we need to understand that in these instances when these things happen, that God does not cherry pick people for them to suffer from these things. What does the Bible tell us? God is no respecter of persons. And therefore, sins have consequences on either side. One of the best examples of that I can think of is in the life of David, 2 Samuel chapter 11. how that whole situation snowballs from one sin. On David's side, where it leads all the way to murder, but the consequences don't stop there. Yes, Uriah lost his life because of the sins of another man and how far he was willing to go to try to cover that up. But there were consequences which came from David's sin, was it not? Death of that child. You see, both things are painful, both things are suffering, but the consequences were on both sides.
Do you think that God knows that these people that get cancer knows they're going to get it before they get it? And, you know, most of these things are either lifestyle or genetics. Did he put this gene in these people to let cancer grow somewhere along their life after they're grown, you know, enough in years, or even the children? These are things that we may not ever have good answers to.
And I really don't know, Ernie. That's one I have wondered, because there does seem to be some kind of genetic component. Now, there are choices that are made that exasperate those kind of things. You think about somebody smokes 12 packs of cigarettes a day for, you know, however many years.
Well, you're predisposed to get these diseases, and what you do brings it on quicker.
Yeah. And time and such, but certainly God does know everything about us, but that's a question I don't know that I could answer honestly. Go ahead, Doug.
I'll give you my opinion on that. I would seriously doubt that God puts a gene in someone to give them cancer.
Exactly, because I don't think God would set out to
any more than
intentionally do something to hurt.
Say that again, Doug.
I would seriously doubt that God put a gene in some family to give them cancer. Any more than he sent Hurricane Katrina to blast the city of New Orleans, like I heard from so many people say.
Can those things develop?
Yes.
Yes.
I believe that those things are going on as a result of the circumstances of the world that we're living in.
Yeah. And I think that's really the source of all disease. You know, because one of the other areas outside of your own choices and the choices of others is the choices of generations prior to you. Now, a lot of times we think about that in a moral sense. We think about the moral decline of a nation from generations on past as it's steadily gone down to the point where it is now. But that can also be true in a physical sense. You know, as the world has declined and things, you know, are winding down over time, that things can develop. Different diseases develop. Even like this, the strains of COVID that, you know, became what they became didn't exist at one point. They were created in a lab somewhere, you know, in China. So things can be manipulated where they are worsened or more prevalent. You know, matter is neither created nor destroyed, we know, but it can be manipulated into something else. You know, all cancers are a form of the same thing. They just attach and attack different things. So I think, Doug, you make an excellent point there.
My favorite saying in regard to whether God does evil to people, as I said, is blame God for nothing but credit him for everything.
Yes.
Meaning never attribute any negative thing to God, but you can give him credit for every good thing that comes in life. And that's just my philosophy on it.
But for a lot of people, that's awfully hard to do.
It's hard to do because they've been there and they've seen it. And I realize, I stipulate,
Oh, yes.
you know, I'm kind of like Job before, you know, the bad things happen to me. I feel like I've got a hedge around me, and you know, the rubber meets the road when the bad things actually come to your life. But I think that's, as we'll study that book later, that's kind of what that book is about, to show you how do you react to God in the face of extreme adversity, and some of the things that we talk about.
And that's probably part of his plan too. He does this to see how you're going to react.
Yeah.
Positively or negatively. And these children that die before the age of accountability,
We don't have to worry about it. Yeah.
we're the ones left here.
Exactly.
It pains us that our children are dying and gone, but the whole idea of Christianity, in my opinion, is to live the life where you're going to be with them one of these days when you die.
Mm-hmm.
Because you already know where they are.
What did David say in the very instance that we're talking about here in 2 Samuel? He got up, he quit his mourning and grieving, cleaned himself up and ate, and everyone was shocked. All of his men were shocked. They said, Master, while the child was sick, you were just in dire straits. And now you get up and you eat. What does he say? I can go to him. That's it.
What did it?
He said, I can go, he can't come to me, but I can go to him.
That's right.
That's it.
I'm going to go to him.
That's right.
And that's the thing.
And I
Yeah.
think that's the way we should look at it, but
Mhm.
that's hard to do too.
It is. It is certainly a test of faith. But it is not a reason to say that there is no God.
Yeah.
No. A lot of people will try to use it that way. But it is not it's not a valid reason
That's
to
just
say
a
that.
rationalization to justify what their presuppositions are.
You
Now,
have to find somebody to blame for it more than,
Yeah.
but people do that.
yeah, you look
You have
for
to
a
find
target.
somebody to put the blame on, and God's a convenient one, but my only answer to that was, at least I got hope.
But I guess what we're ultimately saying here, it is not incumbent upon God to alleviate all suffering.
No.
That's the fallacy in the atheist argument.
Yes. Absolutely. That is a great point. It's not incumbent on God to alleviate all suffering. Are there also some instances this was something I was thinking about earlier today too. Are there also some instances where suffering has been a good thing?
Yeah.
Suffering can also, as devastating as it can also be an eye-opening thing. How many people have changed their lives for the better because of suffering on them from a time to time?
Well, maybe they realize where they need to turn to make it go away.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You know, just a brief example, in a personal reading here lately, I've gotten into the minor prophets again, and just thinking about Jonah. Here's a completely ungodly nation, and granted, they didn't stay faithful forever, but he goes with a message that says, repent, destruction is coming to this place.
And they did.
And they did. All of them did. Absolutely. Now, we've only got about 5 minutes, so I want to cover one more part of this question before we deal with some more next week. But let's get into the idea of natural disasters very quickly. Was the earth perfect when God created it? Yes. He looked upon the creation and saw that it was good. In fact, he said he saw that it was very good. But what does he tell us in Genesis chapter 3? That through the effect of man's sin, the earth became what? Genesis 3:17. I believe it's King James that says it was cursed. So, things do begin to change. There are laws of nature which hold things into position as they are. But because of the influence of sin, sometimes these things will happen. The earth we live on now is completely different than that one that existed prior to the flood. And the flood was a result of the people becoming so evil that the thought of every intent of their heart was on evil continually, which just completely changed the topography.
Can you imagine
of
God
this world.
getting so disgusted with the way things were that he's ready to destroy his children that he created, that he loved, all of them? They were doing something terribly bad.
And I do think it's interesting that he said thought. The thought of the heart. Doesn't mean the actions were continually evil, but
If they weren't doing it, they were thinking about it.
Yeah.
I have a
It's
feeling
interesting.
that some of those thoughts were bearing fruit in actions.
I think some of them were, but were all of them? Is my question.
Maybe not, I don't know.
Maybe not. I don't know.
It's a lot
It's
easier to
just
think an evil
interesting.
thought than it is to do an evil action.
Mm-hmm. But the thing about it, from that point forward, from the Earth's topography changed. How could it not when the depths open up, and the just complete shift to what we see in the world today? And so these are reasons why these things could very much happen, you know. We'll get into some more details of that since we're getting real close to the end here next week, and I want to make sure and give Daniel plenty of time since I skipped him last time he was up to do this, and I'm not going to do that again. So we'll pick up there, continuing with this idea and the problem of sin next week.
Aren't you gonna be gone?
Okay, 2 weeks. That's right, 2 weeks from now.
I will be too.
So Daniel will be teaching in here next week. So 2 weeks from now, we will pick up with these thoughts. But thank y'all for your comments. They were absolutely great, and I hope this has been a good class for y'all. I know I'm getting a lot out of it too. But anyway, I'll give Daniel plenty of time here.